Imagine nothing but snow, no roads, no cities, no lights, no sound, just an endless frozen wilderness, stretching farther than the eye can see. Now imagine you're only a few days away from safety. When something goes terribly wrong, not one man survives, not because of war, not because of a killer, but because the Arctic itself becomes the enemy. In the winter of 1910, 6 highly trained officers disappeared into the frozen wilderness of northern Canada. They carried rifles, carefully packed supplies, powerful sled dogs, and years of Arctic experience. These weren't reckless adventurers chasing glory. They were professionals, men who had survived brutal winters, crossed frozen rivers, and traveled through places most people would never dare to enter. So how did every single one of them vanish? Why did rescuers spend months searching, only to discover a trail that became more heartbreaking with every mile? And what happened during those final days? When the temperature kept falling, their food slowly disappeared, and hope itself began to freeze. This isn't a legend, it isn't folklore. Everything you're about to hear is based on official reports, historical records, and the discoveries that followed, because more than a century later, the story of the Lost Patrol remains one of the greatest survival tragedies ever recorded in the Canadian Arctic. And once you hear what these men endured, you'll understand why the Arctic has never forgiven those who underestimate it. Winter in the Canadian Arctic was never just another season. It was a force capable of erasing trails, burying entire camps beneath fresh snow, and silencing men without leaving behind a single witness. More than 100 years ago, this frozen wilderness remained one of the least explored places on Earth. There were no highways, no GPS, no satellite phones, no rescue helicopters, no emergency beacons. Thing happened out here. You were completely alone across this endless white wilderness. One organization carried the responsibility of bringing law and order to the most isolated corners of Canada, the Royal Northwest Mounted Police. But these officers were far more than policemen. They were explorers, mail carriers, negotiators, survival experts. Sometimes they were the only connection between remote Arctic settlements and the outside world. Every winter, they crossed hundreds of miles, over frozen rivers, through snow-covered forests, and across windswept tundra, where temperatures could fall below -40 degrees, a place where exposed skin froze in minutes, where one storm could erase weeks of progress, and where nature always made the final decision. It was dangerous, but it had become routine. Every patrol followed the same principle: prepare carefully, trust your training, respect the Arctic, then come home. In December of 1910, Inspector Francis Joseph Fitzgerald prepared for another winter patrol. He wasn't a newcomer. He had spent years working in the North. He understood its beauty, its silence, its danger. Joining him were 5 experienced companions, men chosen because they knew what waited beyond civilization. Each had survived Arctic winters before, each understood the risks, each believed that experience would guide them safely home. Together, they began loading their sleds, boxes of carefully measured food, heavy fur clothing, rifles and ammunition, medical supplies, cooking equipment, navigation tools, extra fuel, emergency gear, everything they believed they would need for weeks in one of the coldest places on Earth. Beside them, their sled dogs waited patiently, strong, disciplined, perfectly adapted to the frozen wilderness. Without these animals, the journey would have been impossible. Their destination was Fort McPherson, a remote outpost, hundreds of miles away. It wasn't an unexplored route. Other patrols had completed it. The mission wasn't considered extraordinary. It was simply another winter assignment, another patrol, another journey, another promise to return home before spring. Friends shook their hands, family said goodbye. No one imagined those goodbyes would become permanent. As dawn broke, the dogs leaned into their harnesses. The sled runners scraped against the packed snow. One by one, the patrol disappeared into the endless white horizon behind them. The last signs of civilization slowly faded ahead. Nothing but silence, nothing but snow, nothing but an unforgiving wilderness, waiting patiently for its next victims. At first, everything unfolded exactly as planned. The dogs pulled with steady rhythm. The weather remained cold, but manageable. Camp was made each evening. The men shared meals, checked their maps, planned the next day's route. There was no fear, no panic, no sign that anything was wrong every mile, looked almost identical. Frozen rivers, snow-covered hills, dark forests standing perfectly still. The silence was overwhelming, beautiful, but deceptive, because the Arctic has a dangerous way of convincing even experienced men that they're still in control. A familiar landmark can disappear beneath fresh snow. A frozen river can suddenly become impossible to recognize, and a trail that has guided travelers for years can vanish overnight. Somewhere during those first days, something changed. Inspector Fitzgerald searched for a route he remembered from an earlier expedition, but the landscape no longer matched his memory. The hills looked unfamiliar, the valleys seemed different, the trail was gone. At first, no one panicked. Small navigation errors were common. They adjusted their direction, certain they would reconnect with the correct route before nightfall. But night came, and the trail never appeared. The following morning, they searched again. Nothing. Another day passed, still nothing. Without realizing it, the 6 men had begun drifting away from the only path that could lead them home, and with every step, they moved deeper into the frozen silence of the Canadian Arctic. Their confidence began to fade. At first, it was almost impossible to notice. No one spoke the words, "We're lost." Not yet. Experienced Arctic travelers knew that trails could disappear. Landmarks could change. A frozen river could look completely different after just one storm. So they kept moving, certain the correct route was just over the next ridge, just beyond the next valley. Just one more day's journey. But another day passed. Then another. And another. The trail never returned. The endless white wilderness had swallowed every familiar landmark. Every direction looked the same. The sky blended into the snow. The horizon disappeared. Even the sun offered little help. It became almost impossible to tell where they were or where they had come from. Inspector Fitzgerald faced the hardest decision of the expedition. Continue forward or turn back. Neither option offered certainty. But standing still meant certain death. He chose to retrace their route. It seemed like the safest decision. If they could reach the last place they recognized, they could begin again. But the Arctic had already erased the path behind them. Their own sled tracks had vanished beneath fresh snow. The wind had wiped away every clue. Every decision from this point forward became a gamble. Every mile could be taking them closer to safety or deeper into disaster. Then, their supplies began to disappear. The food they had carefully measured for weeks of travel was running low. Meals became smaller. Breakfast disappeared. Dinner became little more than a few frozen bites. The men tried not to show their concern. But hunger has a way of changing people. It slows your body, clouds your thinking, weakens your judgment. And in the Arctic, clear thinking can be the difference between life and death. The cold became even more brutal. Every breath burned their lungs. Ice formed inside their beards. Their clothing remained damp from sweat, then froze solid overnight. Each morning, they forced stiff fingers into frozen gloves and climbed back onto the sleds, not because they wanted to, because they had no choice. The sled dogs, who had carried them faithfully, were beginning to fail. The animals were exhausted, hungry. Their ribs slowly became visible beneath thick fur. Some collapsed in the snow, unable to stand. Others simply refused to move. Without the dogs, the sleds barely moved at all. The officers were forced to pull the heavy loads themselves. Step after step after step, through waist-deep snow, burning precious energy their starving bodies no longer had. Then came the decision every Arctic explorer feared. To survive, they would have to sacrifice the very animals that had carried them this far. One by one, the sled dogs were killed to provide food for the men and for the remaining dogs. It was a choice no one wanted to make. But the Arctic doesn't care about emotion. It only rewards survival. Even then, it wasn't enough. The weather grew worse. Blizzards rolled across the frozen landscape. Without warning, snow filled the air until the world vanished completely. The men couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. They stopped often, not because they wanted to rest, but because they no longer knew which direction to walk. The Arctic wasn't attacking them with violence. It was attacking them with silence, with confusion, with endless white emptiness. Days turned into weeks. Weeks blurred together. The patrol was no longer trying to complete its mission. Now, they were simply trying to survive another sunrise. Their bodies grew weaker, their movements slower. Even speaking required energy they could barely spare. Hunger, cold, and exhaustion began affecting their minds. Simple decisions became difficult. Memory became unreliable. Hope began slipping away. Inspector Fitzgerald understood the terrible truth. If help didn't arrive soon, none of them would survive. He gathered his men. There was only one chance left. Two of the strongest members of the patrol would push ahead, travel as quickly as possible, reach Fort McPherson, return with food, fresh dogs, and a rescue party. It was a desperate gamble, but there were no better options. The men nodded quietly. No speeches, no arguments, just silent understanding. They packed what little food remained, adjusted their heavy clothing, and disappeared into the blowing snow. The others stayed behind, waiting, watching the empty horizon, listening for sled bells that never came. Hours became days. Days became longer than anyone could measure. Still, nothing. No voices. No dogs. No rescue. Only the endless wind, moving across an empty world. Far away, at the northern outposts, concern was finally beginning to grow. The patrol was overdue. Storms could explain delays, but not this long. Experienced officers knew something was wrong. Very wrong. A search party was assembled. Supplies were loaded. Fresh sled dogs were prepared. The rescuers followed the same route, hopping to find 6 exhausted men, still fighting to stay alive. But the Arctic had changed once again. Fresh snow had buried the trail. Old campsites had disappeared. Rivers looked different. The wilderness offered no answers, only questions. Every mile, the rescuers searched. Every frozen valley, every ridge, every river crossing. Then, they found the first clue. A cold campsite, an abandoned fire pit, a few scattered supplies, half buried beneath the snow. The patrol had been here. That much was certain. But where had they gone next? The rescuers pressed deeper into the Arctic. Another campsite. Another abandoned trail. More discarded equipment. Every discovery told the same story. The men had been fighting. They had stretched every meal, every step, every ounce of strength, trying to stay alive, trying to find the way home. The search party kept moving, not knowing that just ahead, the frozen wilderness was finally preparing to reveal its heartbreaking secret. As the search party pushed deeper into the Arctic, the silence became heavier. No one spoke. No one needed to. Every man understood what they were likely to find. The wind had buried almost every trace of the missing patrol. Weeks had become months. Hope was fading then. Something appeared in the distance, barely visible through the blowing snow, a small shape, half buried beneath layers of ice. As they moved closer, they realized it was a tent, weather-beaten, frozen solid. Its canvas stretched tight by months of relentless wind. No smoke drifted into the sky. No voices came from inside. Only silence, the kind of silence that tells a story. Before anyone says a word, slowly, they pulled back the frozen entrance inside. They found Inspector Francis Joseph Fitzgerald. He hadn't died running. He hadn't died fighting. He had simply reached the point where his body could go no farther. Not far away lay another member of the patrol, still wrapped against the cold, still facing the endless white wilderness, as if he had been waiting for a rescue that never came. The search continued one by one. The remaining members of the patrol were found, scattered across the frozen landscape. Some had collapsed while walking, others appeared to have stopped, only because their exhausted bodies could no longer take another step. There were no signs of violence, no evidence of an attack, no mystery killer hiding in the snow, only the unmistakable marks left behind by starvation, exhaustion, and one of the harshest environments on Earth. Nearby, the rescuers found overturned sleds, broken equipment, empty food bags, worn-out snowshoes. Every object told the same heartbreaking story. These men had not given up. They had kept moving, kept searching, kept believing that somewhere beyond the next ridge, someone would find them. But help arrived too late. The Arctic had already made its decision. When the recovery teams returned, the news spread quickly across Canada. The country mourned, not because 6 officers had failed, but because 6 brave men had done everything humanly possible, and still couldn't defeat nature. An official investigation followed. Maps were studied, weather reports were examined, surviving journals, official records, and every piece of recovered equipment were carefully analyzed. The conclusion wasn't dramatic. There was no hidden conspiracy, no secret enemy, no supernatural force. The patrol had become disoriented. After losing the established trail, fresh snow, changing landmarks, and relentless storms had slowly pushed them farther away from safety. As food ran low, their strength disappeared. As their strength disappeared, their decisions became harder. And once exhaustion took control, the Arctic did the rest. It was a tragedy built, not from one fatal mistake, but from dozens of small ones. A wrong turn, a storm, a delayed decision, a disappearing trail. Each one seemed insignificant until together they became impossible to survive. The deaths of the lost patrol changed Arctic travel forever. Future expeditions carried larger emergency supplies. Routes were documented more carefully. Officers relied more heavily on local indigenous knowledge of the land. Rescue planning improved. Navigation procedures became stricter because 6 men had paid the price for lessons the world would never forget. More than a century has passed. The snow has fallen and melted thousands of times. The winds still sweep across the Canadian Arctic. The rivers still freeze. The blizzards still erase every footprint, just as they did in the winter of 1910. If you stood there today, you would hear almost nothing, just the wind, the same wind those 6 men listened to. During their final days, their footprints are gone, their camps have vanished, the trail they searched for has long since disappeared beneath the snow, but their story remains, not because it is filled with monsters or impossible mysteries, but because it reminds us how small we truly are. When we stand against nature, we build cities, we invent technology, we explore space, yet even today, the wilderness can still humble us. in ways we struggle to imagine. Perhaps that's why the story of the Lost Patrol still feels so haunting. It could have happened to anyone. 6 experienced officers, one familiar route, one unforgiving winter, one series of ordinary decisions that slowly became a fight for survival. And in the end, the Arctic didn't need to chase them. It simply waited patiently, silently, until there was nowhere left to go. Sometimes history's greatest tragedies aren't caused by evil, they aren't caused by war, they aren't caused by violence. Sometimes the greatest enemy is the world itself, cold, silent, unforgiving, and somewhere beneath the endless snow of northern Canada, the memory of 6 brave men still drifts with the Arctic wind, a timeless reminder. Nature always has the final word. Sometimes the greatest mysteries aren't the ones we never solve, they're the ones we do, because once investigators pieced together the final days of the Lost Patrol, one question still refused to disappear. What would you have done if the trail vanished, if the food was almost gone, if every direction looked exactly the same? Would you have kept moving or stayed where you were, hoping someone would find you? We'll never know, because only 6 men knew the answer. The Arctic kept that conversation forever. If this story made you stop and think, tell us in the comments. What was the patrol's biggest mistake? Was it a single wrong decision, or was their fate sealed the moment they stepped into the frozen wilderness? And if you enjoy true stories where history is stranger than fiction, join us for the next mystery, because somewhere, hidden in forgotten files, abandoned places, and the darkest corners of history, another story is still waiting to be uncovered.